I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I never expected them to straight up destroy my property. My name's Owen Aldridge, and I've lived in this house for over 10 years. Got it out of steel, put in the work, and made it my own. The best part? My backyard tall, beautiful oak trees that provided shade, privacy, and a natural wind barrier. Those trees had been standing longer than I had been alive. But apparently, my trees were a problem for Veronica Banks, the HOA president and self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. Middle-aged, always dressed like she was about to host a country club luncheon, and constantly complaining about something. If it wasn't my truck being too commercial for the driveway, it was my grass not being the perfect shade of green according to some ridiculous HOA regulation. This time, though, it was all about the view. See, Veronica's house sat up on a small hill behind mine. She had a nice enough place, but she wanted more. Specifically, she wanted an unobstructed view of the lake beyond my backyard. The problem? My towering oak trees were in the way, and, since she was the HOA president, she thought she could do whatever she wanted. I first heard about her little crusade at an HOA meeting. These trees are an eyesore and bring down property values, Veronica declared, standing at the front of the room like she was leading a town hall. We need to consider landscaping changes for the community's benefit. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. You mean you want my trees gone because they block your view? Veronica gave me a tight-lipped smile. Owen, this is about the entire neighborhood. A more open landscape improves aesthetics and increases home values. Not interested, I said flatly. They're on my property, and they're staying. She didn't argue further, at least, not in front of everyone. But the way she glared at me told me she wasn't done. I should have known she'd pull something. A few days later, I came home from work and stopped dead in my tracks. Logs, branches, and torn-up stumps littered my backyard. My trees, my old, beautiful oak trees, were gone, completely wiped out. It looked like a tornado had torn through, but there had been no storm. I stormed around the yard, trying to make sense of it. That's when I spotted them fresh tire tracks from some heavy machinery. Someone had come in with a crew and taken the trees down while I was gone. I didn't have to guess who was behind it. I marched straight up the hill to Veronica's house and banged on her door. It took less than 10 seconds for her to open it, a smug look plastered across her face. "Ah, Owen," she said, feigning innocence. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" I jabbed a finger toward my yard. "You cut down my trees." She sighed dramatically. "Owen, the HOA made a decision. We needed a more open aesthetic. I believe it's better for the whole community." "You had no right," I snapped. "That was my property." Veronica waved a manicured hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. Besides, it's done now, and I think you'll find it makes your yard feel much more spacious." I clenched my jaw, barely holding back my anger. "You're going to pay for this." Veronica chuckled. "Oh, Owen, the HOA has discretionary funds for beautification projects. You might not like it, but it's all perfectly within our rights." I stared at her, pulse pounding. She thought she'd won. She thought I couldn't do anything about it. She was dead wrong. I didn't waste a second. The moment I left Veronica's house, I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First, my lawyer. Then, the police. Veronica thought she was untouchable, but she had just made a massive mistake, one that was going to cost her dearly. When the police arrived, I walked them through the wreckage that used to be my backyard. The officer, a no-nonsense guy with a sharp gaze, took one look at the torn-up stumps and shook his head. "This wasn't just trimming," he said. "This was deliberate destruction." "Damn right it was," I said. "And I know exactly who did it." I gave them Veronica's name, explained her obsession with removing the trees, and pointed out that she admitted to it when I confronted her. The officer took notes, then knocked on Veronica's door. From my vantage point, I could see her expression shift from annoyed to nervous as she realized this wasn't just a neighborly dispute. She tried to play it off, insisting the HOA had the authority to make landscaping decisions for the neighborhood. But the officer shut her down fast. "Ma'am, this is private property. The HOA has no legal right to remove trees from someone's yard without permission," he said. "This could be considered criminal damage to property. Did you hire a company to do this?" Veronica hesitated, but then she admitted it. She had contracted a tree removal service and paid for it with HOA funds. I couldn't believe the arrogance. She had actually used the community's money to destroy my property. The officer took down the details and let her know that an investigation would be opened. That was good, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to hit her where it hurt. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a sharp-witted guy named Malcolm who had dealt with HOA overreach before. When I explained the situation, he let out a low whistle. "Owen, she screwed up big time," Malcolm said. "This isn't just a civil issue. She committed trespassing, destruction of private property, and potentially fraud by misusing HOA funds. How do we make her pay for it?" I asked. "First, we're filing a lawsuit. You can sue her personally and the HOA as an entity. Second, we'll pursue criminal charges for property destruction," Malcolm said. "And third, this is the fun part, we'll get the HOA members involved. Once they hear she misused their money, they'll turn on her." I like the sound of that. That evening, I sent out an email to every single HOA member, detailing what Veronica had done and how she had funded it. I attached pictures of my destroyed backyard and informed them that legal action was underway. I didn't ask for their support, I just gave them the facts. The reaction was immediate. By the next morning, my inbox was flooded with responses. Some people were furious, demanding an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the situation. Others were worried about their own properties. If Veronica could do this to me, what was stopping her from doing it to someone else? Then came the fallout. The emergency meeting took place in the community clubhouse, and it was packed. People who usually never showed up were there, whispering amongst themselves. Veronica sat at the head of the table, trying to maintain her usual authoritative demeanor, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew she was in trouble. Before she could start the meeting, an elderly man named Richard, who had been in the neighborhood for decades, stood up. "Veronica, did you really use HOA funds to chop down trees on Owen's property?" Veronica gave a tight smile. "Richard, I acted in the best interest of the community. A more open landscape benefits." Richard cut her off. "You spent our money on something illegal." A woman near the back chimed in. "That's not what HOA dues are for." The room erupted. People were demanding explanations, calling for audits, and even questioning whether Veronica should remain HOA president. I let them argue for a while before I stood up and raised my voice. "You all can debate HOA finances as much as you want," I said. "But I'm here to tell you that I've already filed a lawsuit and pressed criminal charges. This isn't just about HOA funds. This is about my private property being destroyed without my consent." That shut them up. Even Veronica looked momentarily stunned. "I hope you all realize," I continued, "that if she can get away with this, none of you are safe. What happens when she decides your fence is too high, or that your garden doesn't match her aesthetic? This isn't just about trees. This is about power abuse." Murmurs spread across the room. I could see people exchanging uneasy glances. The realization was sinking in. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the HOA board members, a woman named Linda, stood up and turned to Veronica. "I move to remove Veronica as HOA president, effective immediately," Linda said. Another board member quickly seconded it. Veronica shot to her feet. "You can't do that. I've done nothing wrong." Richard scoffed. "You trespassed, destroyed property, and misused funds. That's more than enough grounds for removal." A vote was called. One by one, the board members cast their votes. The result? Unanimous. Veronica was officially stripped of her title. As she sat there, stunned and fuming, I leaned in slightly. "Hope you enjoyed that view while you had it," I said. "Because soon, you'll be too busy dealing with legal fees to care." She stormed out of the meeting, but the damage was done. The lawsuit moved forward, and my case was airtight. With the evidence from the tree removal company, the police report, and Veronica's own admission, the court ruled in my favor. She was ordered to pay for the full cost of replacing the trees, plus damages. On top of that, the HOA was forced to conduct a full financial audit, which exposed even more shady spending under her leadership. In the end, Veronica lost everything: her position, her influence, and a massive chunk of her savings. And as for me, I replanted my trees. But this time, I installed security cameras to make sure no one ever tried something like that again. With Veronica dethroned and the lawsuit in full swing, I expected her to lay low. Maybe even try to settle things quietly. But I had underestimated her arrogance. Less than a week after the HOA meeting, I caught wind of her next move. Linda from the board called me up one evening, her voice tight with anger. "You're not going to believe this, Owen," she said. "Veronica's rallying support, trying to paint herself as the victim. Claims you're ruining her life over a few trees." I let out a short laugh. "She destroyed my property and misused HOA funds. I'm not the one who did this to her. Yeah, well, she's been going door to door, telling people you're suing out of spite. She's even trying to frame it like you're attacking the HOA itself, saying you're setting a dangerous precedent by taking legal action. That was rich, considering she had been the one abusing power. Let her spin whatever story she wants, I said. The facts are on my side. And once this lawsuit drags her through court, no amount of whining will save her. Linda exhaled sharply. I just wanted to warn you. A few of the older residents are buying into her nonsense. She's playing the sympathy card hard. That was typical Veronica. She had spent years lording over the neighborhood, but the second she faced consequences, she wanted to be seen as the victim. I had no intention of engaging in her little PR war. Instead, I stuck to the facts. I made sure everyone in the neighborhood had access to the legal documents outlining the case. I even shared the police report and the evidence from the tree removal company. The more people saw the hard proof, the harder it became for Veronica to twist the narrative. And then, the financial audit results came in. The HOA board was required to present the findings at the next meeting, and the turnout was massive. People who never cared about HOA politics packed into the clubhouse, eager for the dirt. Even the board members looked uneasy, shifting in their seats as they prepared the presentation. Linda stood at the front, clearing her throat. We conducted a full review of the HOA's financial records over the past 5 years. Unfortunately, there are serious discrepancies. The room went dead silent. She continued, flipping through a stack of papers. Funds were allocated for neighborhood improvements that never happened. Overpriced landscaping contracts went to companies with direct ties to Veronica. And personal expenses were mislabeled as HOA costs. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Veronica, sitting at the back with her arms crossed, looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Richard, the elderly homeowner who had helped vote her out, stood up. Are you telling us she was using our dues like her personal piggy bank? Linda nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. People erupted in outrage. Some demanded a full refund of their dues. Others wanted Veronica banned from the HOA altogether. Veronica shot out of her seat. This is a witch hunt. Every HOA president has discretionary spending authority. I improved this neighborhood. A middle-aged man near the front shook his head. You cut down someone's trees without permission and charged us for it. That's not an improvement. That's a crime. Veronica's lips pressed together, but she wasn't done fighting. I did what was best for this community. And now, thanks to Owen, we're all going to suffer because of this lawsuit. Do you know how much our HOA insurance is going to go up? I stood up, letting the tension in the room settle before speaking. No, Veronica, we're suffering because you abused your position. This lawsuit is happening because you broke the law. If the HOA is facing financial trouble, that's on you, not me. Linda turned to the board. Given the findings of this audit, I propose we pursue reimbursement from Veronica for all misused funds. The board members exchanged glances before nodding. Veronica's face turned an ugly shade of red. You can't do that. Linda met her gaze evenly. Actually, we can. And we will. With that decision sealed, there was no escaping it. Veronica wasn't just dealing with my lawsuit anymore, she was now facing legal action from the HOA itself. And the best part? Her own neighbors had turned against her. A week later, I got a call from Malcolm, my lawyer. Good news, he said. Veronica wants to settle. I felt a slow grin spread across my face. She finally realized she can't win? More like she finally realized how expensive this fight is going to get. She's offering to pay for the trees and some damages, but she's trying to avoid admitting fault. That wasn't going to fly. Tell her the only way I drop this lawsuit is if she covers every cent of damages, legal fees included, and issues a formal written admission of wrongdoing, I said. Malcolm chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. I'll let her lawyer know. 2 days later, Veronica caved completely. The settlement was finalized, and she was forced to pay for everything plus a little extra for the hassle. But the real victory? The HOA officially banned her from holding any position of power ever again. She had spent years controlling the neighborhood, thinking she was above consequences. But in the end, her greed and arrogance brought her crashing down. And as I stood in my backyard, watching my newly planted oaks sway in the breeze, I couldn't help but enjoy the irony. Veronica had wanted a better view. Now, all she had was a front row seat to her own downfall. With the settlement locked in and Veronica permanently barred from the HOA board, I expected her to slink away in disgrace. But if there was one thing I had learned, It was that people like her never went down quietly. The neighborhood buzzed with the aftermath of her downfall. Some of the older residents, the ones who had blindly followed her leadership for years, still clung to the idea that she had been misunderstood. Others, especially those who had always resented her overreach, were practically celebrating. The board wasted no time implementing new financial oversight policies, ensuring no future president could misuse funds the way Veronica had. I had barely started enjoying my victory when Linda showed up at my door one afternoon, looking exasperated. "You're not going to believe what Veronica is up to now," she said the moment I answered. I sighed, stepping aside to let her in. "Let me guess. She's trying to worm her way back into power?" Linda shook her head, dropping a folder onto my kitchen counter. "Worse. She's suing the HOA. That caught me off guard." "On what grounds?" "She's claiming wrongful removal from the board and defamation," Linda said. "She's trying to argue that the accusations against her damaged her reputation and that the HOA had no authority to remove her the way we did." I flipped through the papers, scanning the legal jargon. "This is ridiculous. She misused funds, destroyed private property, and got caught. She has no case." Linda rubbed her temples. "She's desperate, Owen. She's trying to claw back anything she can. And the worst part? She hired a lawyer who's actually halfway competent. They're trying to argue that the financial audit was biased and that the board acted out of personal vendetta rather than legal cause." That was a stretch, but it meant one thing. Veronica wasn't done fighting. I leaned against the counter, considering my next move. If she wants to make this a legal battle, then we play it smart. We make sure every single piece of evidence is airtight. If she wants to fight, we bury her in facts. Linda nodded. "The board is already preparing, but we could use your help. You've dealt with her more than anyone." I wasn't about to let Veronica wiggle out of the consequences of her actions. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I worked closely with Malcolm, my lawyer, and the HOA's legal team to ensure every detail of Veronica's misconduct was documented. We gathered witness statements from residents who had seen her misuse funds, emails where she had openly discussed removing my trees without permission, and even records of inflated landscaping contracts she had approved. When the court date arrived, the entire neighborhood was watching. Veronica walked in with carefully practiced confidence, dressed in a way that screamed, "respectable victim." But the moment the proceedings began, it became clear that her case was built on nothing but desperation. Her lawyer tried to argue that her removal from the board had been unlawful, but the HOA bylaws were crystal clear. Financial misconduct was grounds for immediate dismissal. Then he pivoted to the defamation claim, saying that the accusations had caused her severe emotional distress and damaged her standing in the community. Malcolm countered smoothly, laying out the hard evidence. The financial audit was conducted by an independent firm, meaning there was no bias. The tree removal company had provided written statements confirming Veronica had ordered the work, despite having no legal authority to do so. And as for her reputation, that had been destroyed by her own actions, not by anything the HOA or I had done. The judge didn't take long to decide. Veronica's lawsuit was dismissed entirely. Not only that, but she was ordered to reimburse the HOA for all legal fees. The moment the ruling was announced, Veronica's carefully composed mask cracked. Her face twisted in fury as she realized she had lost yet again. She stormed out of the courtroom, refusing to acknowledge anyone. I walked out a few minutes later, feeling the weight of months of legal battles lifting off my shoulders. Linda caught up to me outside, shaking her head. "She really thought she could sue her way out of this," she said. "Veronica's problem is that she thinks rules don't apply to her," I replied. But today proved otherwise. The neighborhood moved on without Veronica's influence looming over it. The HOA, under new leadership, focused on actual improvements instead of pointless power grabs. And me? I finally got to enjoy my property without worrying about some entitled neighbor deciding they had the right to take what wasn't theirs. Veronica eventually sold her house and moved out of the neighborhood, unable to handle living among people who knew exactly what she had done. As I sat on my back porch one evening, watching the new oak tree sway gently in the breeze, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetic justice of it all. Veronica had wanted a perfect view. Instead, she got a perfect downfall. Veronica's departure from the neighborhood should have been the end of it, but she had left behind a mess that still needed cleaning up. The lawsuit had been won, the HOA had been reformed, and she was officially out of power, but the damage she had done to the community lingered. The financial audit had uncovered more than just her personal misdeeds. It had exposed years of mismanagement and reckless spending under her leadership. Now, the new board had to deal with the fallout, and I found myself reluctantly involved in the process. Linda, now the acting HOA president, knocked on my door one evening with a tired expression. She held a thick folder under her arm, her fingers drumming against the cover like she was debating whether she wanted to hand it over. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, dropping the folder onto my kitchen counter like it physically burdened her. "You're not going to like this," she said. That was never a good way to start. I flipped open the folder and skimmed the first few pages. It was a breakdown of HOA expenses over the past several years, a deeper dive than the initial audit had gone. The numbers were staggering. Veronica hadn't just misused funds for personal projects, she had been funneling money into shell contracts, hiring companies that never actually completed the work they were paid for. Fake invoices, padded expenses, and projects that had been completed on paper but never actually happened. I let out a slow breath, rubbing my temples. She wasn't just corrupt. She was running a full-on scam. Linda pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "We have two options. We can try to sweep this under the rug, pretend we never saw it, and move on. Or—" I cut her off before she could finish. "We go after her." Her eyes met mine, and she nodded. "Exactly. But it won't be easy. She's already gone, and she'll lawyer up the second she realizes we're not done with her." That didn't matter. Veronica had spent years abusing her position, and just because she had been forced out didn't mean she got to walk away without consequences. We spent the next few days gathering more evidence. Linda brought in a forensic accountant to examine every transaction, and what they uncovered was even worse than we had anticipated. Veronica had been siphoning money into bogus maintenance projects, charging the HO for repairs that never happened, and even using community funds to cover personal expenses under the guise of neighborhood improvements. The most outrageous expense? A massive bill for tree removal and landscaping services that far exceeded what it should have cost to remove the trees from my yard. She hadn't just destroyed my property, she had overcharged the HOA for it, pocketing the difference. With the evidence in hand, we met with the HOA's legal counsel and filed a formal complaint. This time, we weren't just suing her for damages. We were pursuing criminal charges: fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. The case moved quickly. Veronica might have thought she was free, but she had left a paper trail a mile long. Her legal team tried to argue that the board had been complicit, that the spending had been approved through proper channels, but the evidence was undeniable. When the court date arrived, Veronica walked in looking composed, but there was a stiffness to her posture, a tension in the way she carried herself. She knew this wasn't like the last case. This wasn't just about her abusing HOA power, this was about real crimes with real consequences. Linda and I sat side by side as the prosecution laid out the charges. Page after page of falsified invoices, payments to non-existent companies, and transactions that had no legitimate purpose. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at Veronica with a look that made it clear he wasn't buying whatever her defense was trying to sell. Then came the testimony. Former board members, residents, and even contractors took the stand, detailing how Veronica had manipulated the system for her own gain. The forensic accountant presented the evidence in painstaking detail, walking the court through each fraudulent expense. By the time he was finished, there was no doubt Veronica had been stealing from the neighborhood for years. Her lawyer made a last-ditch effort to negotiate, suggesting that she repay the funds in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the judge wasn't interested in leniency. When the verdict was read, Veronica sat motionless, her face pale. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The sentence? A hefty fine, full restitution to the HOA, and several years of probation. No more easy escapes, no more manipulation. As Linda and I walked out of the courtroom, she let out a breath of relief. "It's finally over." I nodded, watching as Veronica was let out by her lawyer, her perfect facade shattered. She had wanted control, power, and a perfect view. Now, all she had was a front-row seat to her own downfall. With Veronica officially convicted and her influence over the neighborhood reduced to nothing, the community could finally breathe again. The HOA, now under responsible leadership, focused on restoring what she had damaged. But just because she had been removed didn't mean the problems she left behind disappeared overnight. Linda and the new board had a mountain of financial issues to sort through. The restitution payments from Veronica covered some of the missing funds, but not all of them. Many of the bogus contracts and shady dealings she had arranged had drained the HOA's reserves to dangerously low levels. It would take years to fully repair the financial damage she had done. Despite all this, there was a renewed sense of unity among the homeowners. People who had once avoided HOA meetings now participated, eager to ensure that nothing like Veronica's reign of corruption happened again. Rules were revised, transparency policies were enacted, and for the first time in years, the board operated with actual accountability. But Veronica herself? She wasn't handling her downfall well. Even though she had avoided jail time, the consequences of her actions followed her everywhere. The fines she had to pay were substantial, and the legal fees alone had drained her savings. She had been forced to sell her house at a loss just to cover the costs, and word quickly spread about how her financial ruin had left her scrambling. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved into a small condo in a less exclusive neighborhood, where she no longer had the power to dictate how other people lived. She had gone from ruling over a community to just another resident in a place where no one cared about her self-importance. One evening, I was out back, admiring the new oak trees I had planted to replace the ones she had destroyed. They weren't as tall yet, but they were growing strong, and in time, they would restore the natural beauty she had so callously taken away. Linda came by, holding a folder under her arm. She had stopped by a few times since the trial, mostly to update me on the HOA's progress. This time, though, she had a different expression, a mix of satisfaction and something close to amusement. She handed me the folder. "Thought you'd want to see this." I flipped it open and scanned the first page. It was a legal notice, but not one involving me or the HOA. This was a collections notice against Veronica. She had defaulted on one of her restitution payments, and the court had placed a lien on what little property she had left. I raised an eyebrow. "She's already falling behind?" Linda nodded. "Seems like it. Turns out, when you spend years living beyond your means and stealing from your neighbors, it catches up with you." I closed the folder, setting it on the patio table. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could do whatever she wanted and never face consequences. Linda pulled out a chair and sat down. And now? She's barely scraping by. No power, no influence, no money. I leaned back, watching the trees sway in the breeze. Poetic justice. She nodded. The best kind. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt a true sense of closure. The damage Veronica had done to the community would take time to fully heal, but it was healing. The neighborhood was stronger, the HOA was better managed, and most importantly, people had learned a valuable lesson about standing up to corruption. As Linda left, I stayed outside a little longer, taking in the quiet, peaceful evening. Veronica had wanted a better view, and she had destroyed my property to get it. Now, all she had left was a view of her own downfall.